Hello, Config 2021. My name is Matt Rosenzweig. I am a design technologist at Peacock. And for the next little bit, we'll be talking about bringing truth to Figma. And in the context of this situation, truth is really all about trying to bring the properties of the real built product that our users are using in the real world into Figma during the design phase and making sure that what we have in Figma matches up to what we have in code as closely as possible. So a little bit about what we'll be going through. We'll be talking about what happens when design systems meet real-world complexity. We'll be talking about the process of turning informal standards into formal standards. And we'll be talking about the needs of balancing accuracy with creative flexibility in the context of a design system. A little bit about myself. I've mostly been a developer for the majority of my career. I'm currently a design technologist, which is still a developer, but these days I mostly work with a design team instead of being part of a larger technology or engineering team. My current role falls into three main areas. I work on prototyping, I work on design systems for Peacock, and I also work on a lot of our A/B testing activities. And really, I'm happiest in that sort of weird gray area between design and development, visuals and code, and all those sorts of fun things. A little bit about Peacock. We are a streaming service available in the US. We launched almost a year ago in July of 2020. And Peacock is the home for all kinds of film and TV entertainment. We also have live sports, live news, and several other genres and bits of our catalog that fit just about any taste that's out there. A little bit about our operating environment, which is really trying to unpack sort of the situation that we carry out design inside of Peacock. Just a little bit of history about our overall environment. As you might be able to tell from the name NBC Universal, our company is a combination of two long-standing companies in the media and entertainment industry in the United States. Universal, which is a film studio, it's the oldest film studio in the United States, and NBC, which is the oldest broadcaster in the United States. Between these two companies, we have about 200 years of history of carrying out creativity at an industrial scale and covering all forms of mass media and communication. NBC Universal is owned by a parent company named Comcast, who also owns another subsidiary called Sky, which is a cable and satellite provider in Europe. And one of the interesting things here is that Sky has a streaming service called Now TV, and Peacock was built on top of the Now TV platform. We're also, in addition to being distributed organizationally through subsidiaries and parent companies, we're also distributed geographically. So we have teams throughout the United States. We also have teams in the UK and in Portugal. And a little bit about the specifics of our design environment. So because of this inherited platform from Now TV, we have a lot of inherited patterns. This can be anything from entire content management systems that are used to manage our marketing site, as well as our content library inside of Peacock. We're a mix of internal and external teams, specifically with our design practice. Our user interface components are a mix of components that come out of a centralized library, as well as user interfaces that are only available in very specific parts of our product. Also, Peacock was built and launched under a bit of a crunch time, as well as on a pretty steep learning curve as designers were coming into Figma from other design tools. We had new groups of people that hadn't worked together before who were needing to work out process as we went. And we had this large distributed organization. So it was a little bit challenging. but we did have some really good sort of foundations to build on top of. So this talk is really going to be focused on Peacock's web UI architecture. We have a lot of other platforms across smart TVs and streaming devices, but that won't really be what we're focused on today. What we're really focused on is the web. And in the context of Peacock, if you come to peacocktv.com, this might look like one big application to you, but really behind the scenes, it's several different applications. So we have one that handles users signing in, signing up for Peacock, handling their billing information. We also have another application that helps users manage their devices and which devices they're using Peacock on. We have another app that handles all of our customer support as well as serving up articles from our knowledge base. And we have an application that handles the rendering and serving of all of our landing pages and the marketing site for Peacock. The fifth one down below in gray is what we call the viewing experience. And this is sort of the core part of Peacock where you're browsing our content catalog, you're watching our titles and things of that nature. But we won't really be focusing on that part today. And then on the right side of this slide is a diagram of a library of user interface components that we have called Peacock Toolkit. This is a private NPM module for developers that are familiar with working with NPM or working in the Node ecosystem. And it's put together with several different pieces of open source technology. We're using Storybook, which it was cool to see several other teams that presented yesterday are also using Storybook. This is a great piece of software that helps quite a bit with developing component-based user interfaces. Our components are built in React and our CSS is written in Sass. And then we also have some developer tools inside of Peacock Toolkit that help us with automated testing like Jest and Cypress, as well as our build tooling, which is handled with Webpack. And so Peacock Toolkit is published to NPM as a private module, and then it's pulled into these 4 applications as a dependency. So this is all amazing. We've got this great technology platform that was already proven to be able to work at scale from Now TV. We've got a great design team that has come up with a really compelling product for Peacock. And we've got our great technology teams that have built everything out and got us launched. It's all pretty amazing, but there's just one problem, which is that a lot of what we have in Peacock Toolkit and a lot of what we ended up with in our code base is not necessarily synced up perfectly in Figma. And so the things that are out of sync between our code base and Figma are things like colors, where we might be using different names for the same color, or in our code base, we might have some colors that are not available as saved color styles in our Figma library. We also have a similar problem with our text styles. So we would have names for our text styles in Figma that didn't necessarily match up to what our developers were using. We had a lack of alignment with responsive breakpoints and knowing exactly when in CSS things would transition from mobile to tablet to desktop, and how to match up the frame sizes and the grids that we're using in Figma to mimic the same responsive behavior that our code base has. And then finally, our React components behaved differently from the Figma representation of those components. And I'll get into a little bit more detail about that further on. So we'll jump into some examples, and we'll start with some of our design tokens with colors and text, and then we'll focus on some more component-based examples. So looking at our color styles in Figma, this is directly out of the library that we use day to day to do our product design at Peacock. And you can see here, we've got our colors set up, and this is pretty good. It's working for what we're doing, but it's not exactly matched up to what we have in the code base. So if we jump over to Storybook, we can look at our design tokens here and see how we have some of our colors set up in Peacock Toolkit. So we'll jump over and we're going to look at some code directly out of Peacock Toolkit and compare that to what we set up in Figma after doing this audit. So you can see here, we've synced up the color names and the hex values. While yellow was already set up correctly, we did find some small differences in hex codes between our code base and our colors that were saved in Figma. We also have these somewhat interesting names for our grays in our code base. And we decided, as a goal of having a shared vocabulary with our developer team, that we would also use these color names in Figma. I think eventually we'll revisit these and rename them to something else, but the important thing was that we wanted to get those matched up in the meantime. And so we went through this process, and at the end we were able to come up with a page in our library that had some color specimens set up on it. And we were also able to have our right panel here with our styles set up in a nice orderly way with nested sections for certain categories of colors. We did a similar thing with our text styles, similar sort of process where we went into Figma and we wanted to take a look at what we had saved in our library. As you can see here, these are, they're close, but what we found when we got into the details were that these names did not match up to the names that were used in our code base. And we were also missing a lot of styles in Figma that existed in our code base, while at the same time also having styles defined in Figma that did not exist in our code base. So jumping over to Peacock Toolkit and what we have in Storybook, in code, our text styles are named things like heading, heading medium, title, and title large. And those names stay the same whether you're using them on mobile, tablet, or desktop. And it's just that the font sizes and the line heights and some other properties of those fonts change as you transition between those device types. So jumping back in and taking a look at some code that comes straight out of Peacock Toolkit compared to what we ended up with after this process in Figma, you can see here that we've matched up the name between code and Figma. We've also matched up the text properties like the font size and the line height and the font weight. We've also organized everything on the right to be in nested sections in our styles panel. So we have one section of type styles for mobile, tablet, and desktop, and those match up to the responsive breakpoints that we have in code. If you're not familiar with what you're seeing on the left, no worries. These are media queries, which are sort of the basic foundation building blocks of responsive web design. And they just match up to different device types here on the right. And so we went through this process, and at the end, we came out with another page in our library in Figma that had all of our type specimens, and we had really high confidence that these were matched up exactly to what we have in CSS and in our code base. Moving on to more component-based things after we focused on a couple styles. This one was interesting. This is our notification component. Pretty much every design system you come across will have something like this in it. And in our situation, when we went to look at our Figma library, we didn't actually have a notification component. What it turned out was happening was that designers were mostly drawing from pre-existing screens in Figma and copying notification elements out of those into the screens that they were working on, and then modifying them as needed for their purposes. So we'll just go ahead and take a look at what we had in Storybook when we started. We've got a notification here, and if we scroll down a bit, it can have those different modes of success, an error, a version that can't be dismissed, versions that can be dismissed by the user, and things of that nature. And when we started trying to bring this into Figma, We had some newer features available to us, like variants and some of the more advanced parts of auto layout, which turned out to be really handy. So we went through a similar exercise where we wanted to match up some of our CSS properties to things in Figma. We did this with things like the border radius matching up to the corner radius. We also did it with the padding, which, as you see here, padding in CSS corresponds really closely to how padding works in auto layout. And this is a bit of shorthand. If you just type in 16 and 20 into the padding field here where it says mixed on the right, this is what you will get. So there's a lot of shared, somewhat hidden DNA between CSS and Figma that I've found really interesting as we've been working on this. And it's been sort of helpful in this audit to know kind of how certain aspects of code and CSS match up to how things work in Figma. Also on that topic, there's a set of CSS properties called Flexbox. And these properties really match up super close to how auto layout works in Figma. Lots of inspiration there, I think, and just sort of interesting discoveries along the way. On the React side of this component, here on the left is a page out of our Peacock toolkit that shows all the different properties this React component can take. And on the right, we've got an example of the properties that our variant-based components in Figma support. So you'll see here with things like mode, we matched that up exactly between our code base and Figma. So we're using the same names for things, and also with persistent, we're doing something similar. In Figma, if you just use true and false as your options for a variant property, that'll allow you to get the little switch feature in the panel on the right. So we sort of modeled that very similar to how we have it set up in React as well. But we had to deviate a little bit here with our children component or children property. This is something that's special in React. And really what it allows it to do is React components can take in other React components and render them inside of themselves. So this works a lot like nested elements in HTML, but there wasn't a great way for us to model this in Figma. So we ended up sort of falling back on our design system guidelines, where we sort of have guides of what components can be placed inside of a notification. And really the only one that we use it with is our button component, which you can see here. So in our notification component in Figma, we just gave it a button property because that was enough for our design team to get the work done that they needed to get done and have the flexibility that they needed. And so going through this process, we ended up with a variant-based master component that looks something like this. Moving on a bit to our button component, another classic out of any design system. We did have this in Figma, but we found that there were some styling issues with it. So it was using a typeface that we weren't standardized on. It wasn't using saved text styles or saved color styles, and it just didn't match up super close to what we had in production. So we jumped over to Storybook and did an audit to see what we needed to bring in. We also found that we have several different versions of how the button can render, and we wanted to make sure that we had those represented in Figma. So once again, we've got code from our Peacock toolkit on the left, and we've got Figma on the right. We did the similar sort of exercise between things like the border radius and the padding and alignment. And then we've also moving over to the React property side of things. This is where we kind of deviated more than we did with the notification component. And it was really just to help our designers have good ergonomics with this as they were doing their design work. So in mode, in our code, that's the property that we use to switch between primary and secondary buttons, for example. But for our designer audience, labeling that as type really made more sense for them. We also decided to fold the compact mode property into the size property in Figma because it just made more sense conceptually as well. And then we also did the same thing with our disabled and outline properties. And we ended up just making a style property in Figma that sort of, again, gives designers that full flexibility to get any look of a button that they need without us having to have a lot of different variant properties in Figma. And so we went through this, and this is the master component that we ended up with after that process. And it's been serving us well so far. So I want to talk a little bit about how we manage this and the workflow that we go through as we want to make changes to our Figma library and our Peacock Toolkit library in Storybook. It really kind of semi-obviously starts with identifying a change to be made. So this could be a font size that we want to change, or it could be a new version of a button that we want to introduce to our design system. We'll then draft that change in our Figma library, but importantly, we will not publish it out yet. And I will say life is rapidly getting better at this step. Even just a month or two ago, we were having to do things like label things as draft or work in progress in our Figma library, or make things private components until we were ready to publish them. But with the feature that was announced a few weeks ago, where we can now publish components and styles on a one-by-one basis, that has really helped us out. And then obviously the merging and branching features of Figma's versioning that were announced yesterday are going to be a big game changer for us. So once we have these changes drafted, we'll then submit a change request to our technology team. They'll pick it up in a sprint and carry out development work on it. They will then let us know when changes are ready for us to validate and test in a staging environment. Once everything is looking good there, the technology team will release those changes to production. And as I mentioned earlier, Peacock Toolkit is a private NPM package. So what this looks like is that they will publish a new version of that package to NPM. And in very close succession after this happens, then we'll publish those changes to our Figma library. And we've really got a goal of trying to have what we have in Figma and what we have in code in production match up as closely as possible. And so for our last few minutes, I want to take you through a couple guiding principles that we've been falling back on as we've worked through this. This has definitely been a challenge. We've hit a lot of roadblocks and bumps along the way. It's totally expected because I think this is pretty tough work, and we're sort of, working on newer sets of problems in the design world that haven't been as prevalent in previous eras of our industry. But the first one is really prioritizing accuracy, but balancing it with the needs of the team. So when we were trying to get started on this work, we found ourselves kind of stuck of deciding, do we try to have Figma match our code base as closely as possible, even if it's not exactly what we want? Or do we want to have a lot of creative flexibility in Figma, even if what it represents doesn't necessarily exist in our code base? And we decided to go with accuracy and matching what's in the code base as closely as possible, specifically in our design system and our library, because that just felt like the kind of higher order problem that we needed to deal with first. And if designers needed creative flexibility, they were able to do that outside of the library and in their own sort of screens that they were working on. I also need to give a shout out to having a to-do list for this kind of work. We didn't just sit down and knock all of this out in a couple weeks. This is something that's been a bit of a slow burn. And we've had to sort of focus on getting a list of tasks ready and getting the work ready so that when we have free time, we can pick it up and it's ready and it's there for us to do that. So this could be a backlog and a project management tool. It could be rows in a spreadsheet, whatever works for you. is okay. The important thing is to just have a list and have it be something that you're actually going to work on executing against. For our team, we set this up in Jira as a design system epic. And you can see here, this is exactly the list of issues that were in the epic as of, I think, a week or two ago when I took this screenshot. And we are, working through this over time. Also on that topic, definitely need to shout out setting small goals and celebrating small wins. This design system work we found works pretty well with an iterative approach. It's pretty hard to do it all at once and then push it out all at once. And then also celebrating the small wins. When we first had that moment of finally getting a big set of type styles together that matched our code base exactly, we definitely took a moment as a team to kind of celebrate and mark that occasion, because that was a big win for us. Collaboration is totally crucial in this type of work as well. Putting designers and developers together, I think, is going to make this be carried out in a more effective way. And I think just, for those of us that have been in this industry for a while, this sort of collaboration relationship, at least in my opinion, seems to only really be heading in one direction, which is that designers and developers are really getting closer and closer together with the tools that we're using, the sort of domain information and knowledge that ends up in both areas, and things like that. And finally, give yourself a break. Seriously, this is really hard work. It's super difficult. We had some fits and starts as a team with this. We took a couple wrong turns and had to back up. It's totally okay. Embrace those things as a team, use them as learning lessons, and, don't take this stuff too seriously. And as I'm wrapping up, I just want to give a couple of thanks and acknowledgements to the teams that I worked with throughout this whole process and continue to work with going forward. I need to give a big shout out to my team, which is the Peacock Commerce Product Design team. I also want to shout out our technology teams that are part of Sky under their sales and service organization. And then I need to give a big shout out to the global open source and Figma communities, because without that, none of this would have been possible. I've learned so much from watching how other people and other teams are doing this. Open source software like Storybook has just been a huge help for us. It's really kind of incredible that all of this is happening out in the world. As you might be able to tell, I'm a huge nerd for this stuff. I would love to continue the conversation. You can find me on Twitter. You can also reach out to me via email, and I'm also on the Figma community. If you want to get a closer look at these slides, they are also published on the Figma community. So if you want to talk more, feel free to reach out via Twitter or email. Thanks again for checking everything out that we're up to at Peacock. Have a great rest of config, and I'll see you on the other side.